I am Anabel González, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And I would like to welcome you back to Trade Winds, our bi-weekly virtual event series where we discuss the future of global trade in the era of the COVID-19 pandemic with leading policymakers and experts from across the world. In this, our episode number 8, we will explore the topic: how can the global trading system support growth and jobs to recover from the pandemic? A theme that is vital to countries across all regions as they struggle to support their private sector to reignite economic activity. To lead our conversation today, I am delighted to have with us two great speakers. Let me first introduce Ambassador Carla Hills, Chairperson and CEO of Hills and Company. In addition to her role as a strategic advisor to companies and organizations on matters of trade, investment, and diplomacy, Ambassador Hills has a distinguished career in the public sector, having served as United States Trade Representative and also as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Among her many accomplishments, Ambassador Hills is recognized as a key architect of the North American Free Trade Area Agreement, the NAFTA. I'm also very pleased to say that she is an honorary director at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, among many other important affiliations. I'm also very pleased to introduce John Denton, who since 2018 is the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce based in Paris. John is a global business leader, an international legal and policy advisor in international trade and investment. And he's also very well recognized for his role as business advocate in the WTO and the United Nations system. John represents 45 million companies in over 100 countries with a mission to make business work for everyone, every day, everywhere. We at TradeWinds have an audience spanning across 80 countries, so we still have a way to go to catch up with John and the ICC. So, welcome to both of you, and thank you very much for being here with us at TradeWinds. I will turn it over to Ambassador Hills and John in a moment. But for you in the audience, please get ready to submit your questions using the Q&A feature in the Zoom platform, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. So, in setting the context, let me say that the pandemic and the measures to contain it are causing activity to collapse across the world, triggering job losses, lower incomes, and increased poverty. The International Labor Organization estimates that the equivalent of 555 million jobs have been lost in the first and second quarters of 2020. In many countries, governments are providing extraordinary levels of fiscal support, up to 10.5 trillion US dollars and rising, to try to stabilize economies, sustain companies, and minimize the impact on workers. In many others, limited fiscal space and informality constrain governments' capacity to mitigate the damage. Now, for both advanced and developing economies, trade is a powerful, cost-effective tool to alleviate the devastating effect of COVID-19. Trade can protect lives across the world by improving access to affordable medical supplies. When a vaccine is ready, trade will be critical to provide access for all. Trade can also play a key role in the recovery. As the pandemic wreaks havoc across firms and industries, governments can make all efforts to keep supply chains functioning, coordinate border crossing, and minimize disruptions. And as countries begin to prepare the groundwork to help rebuild the world economy, global trade is critical to long-term growth and competitiveness. Unfortunately, before the pandemic struck, trade confrontations, technological disruption, and geopolitical competition were already reshaping the trade and investment global landscape. With managed trade gaining traction, greater fragmentation of trade rules, and weakening global governance, the World Trade Organization was under strain and the business environment more uncertain and volatile. So, unless governments step up their efforts to collaborate, growing protectionism and increased trade barriers risk being a byproduct of the pandemic, at the same time, further exacerbating its negative implications. So, longer term growth depends on multilateral cooperation to provide business certainty, scale back obstacles to trade, and leverage opportunities which the pandemic has accelerated in areas like services trade, the digital economy, and greener supply chains. So let me now turn to our panelists and start maybe with you, John, and ask you in the current economic context, what kind of multilateral trading system is needed to support business recovery and job creation?
Thanks so much, Anabel. And it's great to be with you and Ambassador Hill. I'm a great fan, so it's an honor to be on a video screen somewhere. I think we kind of linked up somewhere. People can see both of us or three of us, so it's a great pleasure to be here. Yeah, by the way, 45 million businesses, I tell you, it's a lot. But the reason I just pause on that for a second is that it's actually also very important for viewers and listeners to understand that what the ICC does is actually, as the institutional representative voice of these businesses, is we bring together the North and the South, the developed and the developing countries. We bring together large businesses, investment funds. We bring together SMEs, micro SMEs. So we touch every sector of the global economy in every region and in every country, say with a couple of exceptions. We're just not very big in North Korea, I have to say. But it's actually interesting because it does give us a huge perspective, but also, and we'll come to this later on a little bit, where we've seen the greatest crisis in the context of COVID-19 has been in the absolute devastation that has been wrought upon the real economy. And when we talk about the real economy, we're generally talking about SMEs and micro SMEs. And sadly, with COVID-19, it shows no mercy. In a way, it's cruel, not just in its human impact, but also in the way it actually applies. So it's asynchronous. So we were seeing the collapse in value chains and supply chains in developing countries, which were not even being hit by the actual human consequences and health consequences of COVID-19. So it's actually it's an asynchronous, and in the sense it operates in a completely uncoordinated fashion. So if you, in the question you asked me, what kind of multilateral trading system, we would actually like a multilateral trading system which was characterized by cooperation, by cooperation between sovereign states, cooperation properly intermediated by a strong institution that can bring together those individual states in a common purpose, which is the preservation of open economies, which actually enable market forces to allow enterprises to do what they do best, which is create prosperity. But as we would say, prosperity leads to peace, security, and opportunity for all. That is our ambition. That is our purpose, by the way. And let me, I also sit on the board of a number of infrastructure investment companies as well. So I have a number of perspectives here. People say the COVID-19 is a black swan. I can tell you, having analyzed all the asset classes that the infrastructure funds I sit on invest in, and we own airports, we own ports, we own roads, we own all. Every single one of those assets has a pandemic risk management plan. So pandemic was never the actual black swan. What is actually the black swan in all this has been the lack of international cooperation. Mm-hmm. That is the piece that was assumed. Mm-hmm. And where has that gone? So again, if we want a multilateral trading system that supports economic growth in the context of COVID-19, we want that actually enables and is supported by international cooperation and by a strong institution that can actually curate and support that and ensure that people live up to the principles for which they sign on. By the way, as I sit here, just as I walked in to take this call, I received the farewell letter from Roberto Azevedo. And again, I have a huge personal regard for Roberto. But this is an opportunity now, and I know he actually in a way enabled that by his peremptory or early retirement from the role, for us to think about what it will take to enable an institution to support governments who will actually be able to deliver or seek to deliver cooperation. And maybe we'll come back to that during the discussion, Anabel. So headline, cooperation. Headline, an effective institution that can actually curate and support that cooperation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. I find it very, very powerful that you say that the pandemic is not the black swan, but rather the lack of cooperation. Really a very powerful message. So maybe let me now ask Carla, how do you think that the business community could work with governments to foster this trade cooperation that John is talking about across countries to fight unilateralism and protectionism?
Well, Annabelle, it's a great pleasure to be with you and with John Denton. And I agree with every word that he has said. My answer to how does the business community work to generate the cooperation that is in such short supply, we really have to define the challenge specifically. And I don't have to tell you that these are turbulent times economically, politically, and technologically that are affecting all political, domestic, bilateral, global relationships. The shift in US policy has been particularly dramatic in recent years. For 7 decades, our government, whether led by Democrats or Republicans, have been a major force in using their diplomacy to help build an open trading system, believing that high tariffs and discriminatory trade arrangements adopted in the 1930s intensified the Great Depression and ignited World War II. And there was a strong public consensus that believed that the free flow of goods, services, capital, ideas, people would benefit nations both rich and poor. And I don't have to tell you, Anabel, because the Peterson Institute has been on the front of this, but according to economic studies, the expansion of trade and investment between 1950 and 1995 has been more than $2 trillion to our GDP, and our allies have benefited as well. Importantly, developing nations have also benefited. Your Dr. William Klein has calculated that on average, for every % of increase in trade by a poor country, decreases their poverty by an equal %. And the increase in global trade since World War II has lifted more than 500 million people out of abject poverty. And enlarging opportunities for poor countries contributes to global security. For when an impoverished nation lacks the resources to seal their borders, enforce their laws, they become havens for international crime. And with these proven benefits, why have Americans and others become hostile to globalization and open trade? And I think there are 2 reasons that stand out. First, a large segment of the public is unaware of the benefits of trade. And second, trade is not only an economic issue, it's a political issue. And I believe that business leaders can make a difference on both. They can make it a priority to explain to employees why trade matters. Too few of our workers know that with only 5% of the world's population in this country, we produce more than 15% of the output. We need markets beyond our borders. And to fill the knowledge gap, businesses could attach a statement to the monthly paycheck stating, X% of our company revenues come from markets beyond our borders, contributing to X% of this paycheck. And also business leaders could talk about why trade matters to local groups, Rotary clubs, local roundtables, as well as mayors and governors who are more concerned about economic issues that affect their municipalities, their states, and often have useful channels into Washington. And beyond our borders, more business organizations could follow the lead of the ICC, but the American Business Dialogue, other groups, where members have adopted a series of recommendations to respond to the challenges of the pandemic. And the Americas Beyond Dialogue have adopted measures that would deal with all governments from the tip of Alaska to the tip of Argentina, and are steps to preserve vital supply chains and joint efforts to reduce trade barriers and promote regulatory convergence. The G20 business group will meet in Riyadh November 20th, and that's in advance of the G20 leaders meeting. That provides the business leaders an opportunity to talk about joint efforts, collaboration to combat protectionism. And I believe the second reason for decreased public support for globalization is rapid change in technology that has widened the prosperity gap and increased inequality. This concern is not easily dispelled, but we must act now because we are warned that technological change will only increase more rapidly as we move forward. In my view, we need to invest a larger portion of the gains derived from open trade and globalization to upgrade our human infrastructure. And that could be a partnership with business. The government could post all jobs on the internet that are open, for example, in the United States, with the location, the salary, and the required training. They could provide a stipend to move a person to where the job is located, and a stipend for them during the period of training. The company could provide the training, and once hired, that person's taxes would go up and help offset the costs, and one could call it a domestic Marshall Plan. Such companies like Walmart have created education programs, which is another way to go for part-time and full-time employees. More than 25,000 employees, I am told, in all 50 states have taken advantage of this program called Live Better You, which offers debt-free college and a workforce certificate. And they report that the promotion rates for participants are double that of their average workforce crew. And so to be competitive for the 21st century, the US needs a workforce that is well-trained and productive. For years, we've given tax incentives to encourage businesses to invest in capital equipment. Today, we need to encourage investment in our human capital, and no group is better equipped to make that happen than our business leaders in partnership with government. And so, Anabel, those are my views.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carla. Very, very powerful and also very pragmatic suggestions on how business and government can work together to support trade, which in turn will support business and workers as well. So thank you very much. Let me now move to the issue of supply chains. We know that most every multinational nowadays is rethinking their supply chain strategy, in part to try to optimize risk management. There is a view out there that excessive globalization of production has created new economic vulnerabilities, prompting some to claim that the era of offshoring is over and that production must come back home. We know the business literature suggests that trade is a critical element, but nevertheless, the political forces sometimes go in another direction. So let me start by asking you, John, how do you think that COVID-19 will impact global value chains in going forward? And in your view, what kind of policies are needed to improve the robustness and the resilience of global value chains?
Oh, great question, Anabel. Can I just refer back to something that Ambassador Hill said?
Yes,
I
please.
couldn't be more about this issue of investment in human capital and the role that business must play. And maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that in Q&A, but it's a piece of, I think, of opportunity, which we really need to think about. I mean, how do we ensure that citizens globally, and I'm talking now particularly about the ICC representation of these 45 million businesses, and many of them are in LDCs in developing countries. how do we ensure that citizens there or people emerging there have the skills to build a meaningful life within a market economy? We want people to actually build a meaningful livelihood in a market economy. We want them to support the maintenance of market economies. So building those capabilities, I think, is a critical element for the opportunities we all see, but we actually need to have a pathway to enable those opportunities to be delivered. On supply chains, look, you got it in one. I mean, there is no doubt that supply chains have become increasingly complex over the last 20, 30 years. You know, I was part of the APEC, I chaired finance and economics in the APEC Business Advisory Council, and a lot of what underpinned the explosion of opportunity in the APEC region was the operation of supply chains. And that all happened because of the hard work around standardization to enable that to happen, so people could actually recognize the various standards in the various economies. And so bringing people out of poverty was actually also very much relied upon the operation of supply chains, which also required not just common standards, but actually a level of open borders to enable that to happen as well. But there is no doubt in COVID-19, up front, there was complexity. But why wouldn't there be? I mean, when you think about opening, closing, red light, amber light, green light, we've got to have our PIIE here. We're going to make our own ventilators. We're going to block someone else from getting access to ventilators. You know, there is a lot of complexity going around there. But I think the untold story here, when we sit back now, and of course, a week is a long time in COVID life as well. We're now 6 months in. Or 6, 7 months in. I mean, it's amazing to actually sit back now and have a look at it. I think the untold story here has actually been the ingenuity of the private sector in the way in which it's been able to adapt and adopt supply chain changes and actually reassemble their supply chains in an extraordinary complex environment in real time with often inadequate information, making decisions. They've actually been able to reassemble their supply chains in a way which has actually almost made it seamless, particularly in developed countries, for people to get access to what it is they need and what it is they want. You know, FedEx, UPS, and others, you know, they've actually delivered stuff. Think about how complex those supply chains are, those logistics are on the way through. So I think the untold story here is actually the robustness and the ingenuity of the private sector in readapting their supply chains. And, you know, thank God for that, because if we left it to governments, frankly, we'd end up with a lot of the defense purchasing disasters we see on a global basis. You know, and what I'm actually reacting to a little bit, Anabel, is the comment that you're replaying here, which is, oh, this is all an evidence that things have gone too far. We need to bring our national supply chains back and nationalize, localize supply chains, localize production, because of failings in the supply chain operation globally. The point I'm making is the supply chains did not fail. The private sector adapted and adopted them. Right. What we're hearing now is governments in many respects and elements within polities arguing for basically rent seeker or protectionist policies. This whole idea of supply chain return is actually often nothing more than protectionism in another form. And so we're now getting this confusion between policy frameworks and reality. The reality is that supply chains have functioned. What we actually need is enabling support for that and governments not to intervene. The idea that a government can redesign a supply chain for an automobile is just beyond ridiculous. Beyond ridiculous. We look at the number of parts, the number of elements and moving parts that need to be put together from a variety of jurisdictions, but even within a jurisdiction. And the idea that by renationalizing, I think, access to supply chains, you actually build greater resilience, actually flies in the face of the reality that if you actually did repurpose a supply chain to be totally within one jurisdiction, then think how vulnerable that is to an epidemic, not even a pandemic, or to a localized outbreak. So these things, I think, need to be weighed up and considered. I think there are policy interventions that would be useful, that could be more useful. There's a couple that I would note. That one of the things we noticed very early on in the COVID-19 crisis, with the collapse of access, and so a number of the value chains, that in order to shift them around and to enable SMEs to continue to participate and produce, they lacked access to business continuity plans. There are some practical things. So we had actually one of the people on the line today, Raul Renard, in my office in New York. We actually created a business continuity plan for distribution through the United Nations to LDCs and developing countries where SMEs and micro SMEs did not have access to it. We had it translated into 6 countries and actually put it onto a smart app, etc. So there are actually practical things you can do. The other aspect in terms of improving the resilience of supply chains is not just business continuity plans, but enabling and helping companies and entities and individuals to actually get access to the digital platform. I think we all realize that access to a digitized platform has been critical here, particularly when human person-to-person mobility has been diminished and person-to-person contact has been eradicated. Digital has actually been the way to go. But you know that in sub-Saharan Africa, I'll give you a number here, but maybe the dimension is right. The number may not be exactly right. But of all the opportunities there in terms of the number of business entities that exist, only about 185 to 200,000 business entities in sub-Saharan Africa actually have a digitized business model.
Right.
I mean, how are we going to win with that kind of number? How are we going to win in terms of preserving the opportunities for social inclusion and economic opportunity? So dramatically shifting our attention, not just to human capability development, as Carla was talking about before, investment in that, but actually investing in support of digitization is going to be key here. And by the way, that's something that we, the ICC, have done. I've just announced a campaign to digitize 1 million SMEs and micro SMEs, but that doesn't go far enough. But what it does do is send a very clear signal. That's a policy area that governments need to get involved with. And frankly, the private sector can be very supportive, and the private sector is. So there are a couple of thoughts. And again, the headline I'd leave you with from this intervention is that it's not the private sector that has failed in terms of the provision. It's actually been government policies. The government's decided not to have stockpiles of PPE. It wasn't the private sector. All these sorts of aspects, I think, need to be considered. The ingenuity of the private sector should be applauded, but there are things we can do to make SMEs and micro SMEs more resilient to participate in the full functioning of supply chain and value chains as well.
Thank you very much, John. And there's one of the several issues that you mentioned that I would like to come back maybe a little bit later, which is the issue of digitizing business and the role of the digital economy going forward, because that is, of course, very relevant for the recovery from the pandemic. So, Carla, let me ask you your views on global value chains and what kind of policies can help build the robustness, the resilience. And let me just also bring in one of the questions that we have from our audience. Odile Santana is asking, how is it that protectionism affects trade collaboration? And I want to bring this in because, of course, this is relevant when discussing global value chains. So let me turn it over to you now.
Let me say that I agree with everything that John said, so I'll try to be short. I think when the impact that COVID-19 had on value chains is that it triggered a notion or a belief, a recognition that we need to have some redundancy where there is critical supplies. That's not just because of COVID-19, but let's supposing there was a flood and you needed a widget from someplace. And if it was indispensable and was going to bring down your business, you better have an insurance, a backup policy. And then there was some greater emphasis on regionalization. Let's get it closer to home. A lot, for example, I think Mexico has benefited. Reshoring has occurred. Japan is actually giving tax benefits to companies that come home. And but basically, firms have done a good job, I think an excellent job of trying to maintain their supply chains. And the companies that, for example, are in China, where we have such tension, most of them have decided to stay because they need to tap into 1.4 billion people consuming their products. And so they're attracted by that large market. But a few will go to Vietnam and in the neighborhood. And the policy, I mean, a lot of this is in reaction to the shortness of the PPE, the products that we needed. But a lot of it is also a result of government protectionism. And I agree with John that I think that companies have done a good job under terrible climate of maintaining their supply chains or trying to manipulate them in a way so that they can continue to be productive.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both very much. And it's interesting to see that while most people have focused on the disruptions, of course, associated with PPE or with the ventilators. The reality is that people continue to have access, as you were saying, certainly in advanced countries and even in some developing countries as well, to such important things like foodstuff, apparel, and others. So I think that the point that you're making, that private sector has kept supply chains running even in these adverse circumstances, is also a very strong one. Now, let me now move to the point of the WTO, because we know that the WTO framework has been critical for managing trade relations, and it has helped to bring growth and prosperity across the world, but it has been confronting problems for some time now. So, in your view, and let me pose a couple of questions associated with this. So, what could be the WTO role to help fight COVID-19? We were talking precisely about access to PPE, access to ventilators. So, what role there for the WTO to help fight the virus? What are some of the priority areas for rulemaking from the perspective of the business community? And I'm mindful that this may be a big plate, but also what systemic reforms are needed in the WTO to adapt the organization to a post-pandemic world, which is not only post-pandemic, but as we were discussing before, it's also confronted by the geopolitical competition, by the disruptions from technology and other complex factors. So maybe Carla, should I start with you on this one?
Well, I'm happy to say that I do think that there is a role for the WTO. It could encourage 100% ratification of the trade facilitation agreement that currently has about 80% of members, and that would expedite the movement of products across borders. They could try to remove import and export barriers on critical products, try to get a consensus on that, and reduce the barriers on agriculture because the need for food in low-income countries has become much more dramatic. And but the WTO needs reform on its own. I think that it was originally developed to have negotiations, so they would sit down and get members to agree to certain rules, monitor those rules to be sure they were carried out, and to have a dispute settlement. And the dispute settlement has crashed, and the negotiations have not gone forward, and the monitoring has not been efficient. So we might get into that, but I think that there's clearly in the WTO framework, there is a role for the WTO to play, and I wish it would.
Thank you, Carla. John, what is your view on this?
Well, I have a couple of views, but I'll start with just an observation about the WTO and its functional response to within the context of COVID-19. And it saddens me in a way to say this because I have such high personal regard for a number of the people involved in the actual functioning of the body. But I would say that the WTO has had a pretty poor, and is having a very poor COVID-19. It might sound a little glib. By the way, I also think the United Nations is also having a very poor COVID-19, and I think we see that play out some of the challenges with various entities there, including the WHO, but we don't have that much time. But the WTO, I genuinely think its response has been relatively feeble. There are a couple of useful things that have happened, but without, I think, the G20 intervening, I think we may still struggle. There is no doubt that when the enormity of the economic crisis, both the demand and supply shock and the effect on the real economy really hit policymakers, the first response was to close borders. So we get that. But what's been really important here, and that we should acknowledge that they could only be temporary. They had to be targeted, proportionate, transparent, and temporary. We need to take them off. And that's where the WTO needs to be doing more heavy lifting here in terms of revealing this and focusing on giving visibility where that's not happening. And the G20 needs to be, in a sense, a powerful ally to get that done. So I think there is actually a level of work that should be done, must be done, that's not being done after an initial, I think, correct view that, okay, we accept the immediate shock has resulted in particular barriers going up, but let's make certain they don't stay for any longer, not a minute longer than they need to. But there are other things. We have to push and shove in Geneva to get the WTO to reconvene that high-level action group on trade finance. I mean, that shouldn't have been an effort. I mean, that was set up by, I'm not an old dinosaur, I haven't been involved with this in very long, maybe 2 years, but having looked at this, that was set up by Pascal Lamy in 08-09, because they saw the looming crisis. In fact, it was a real crisis on trade finance there. So they're just stuff that should have happened. And again, I fully understand that because of social distancing, people can't meet and things like that. But heavens above, you can meet digitally. You can meet as we're meeting today. So there is actually work that should have gone on. Now, so I do think that there are things that can be done and must be done. And I do think that it's up to the institution and those who constitute the institution, including the members, to do more. And certainly they shouldn't be waiting to be asked. They should be diving into these sorts of things as well. And this, because this is going to become even more critical, I think, as we move to the next stage of the crisis. And who knows when that will be, and of course it will be asynchronous and not be exactly where we would like it to be when we look at vaccines, because a vaccine is of no use without vaccination. So unless we can get vaccinations through vaccine supply, through a supply chain that functions, then we're going to have all sorts of problems again. So we need to ensure that the kind of export restrictions, the sorts of things that actually offend against the basic principles of the WTO are well thought through and well managed to ensure that we actually do get those vaccinations out, because the best cure for economic growth is actually a vaccine. There's no doubt about it. But until then, we have to learn to live with it and manage within that context as well. So unhelpful and consistent and actually solid protectionist measures are not going to help us. I think, as Carla has said very eloquently, and I think Anabel, as your institution, would argue robustly as well. But look, with WTO reform, in a way, you go back to basic principles. There's a couple of things I'll quickly say. First, I think we have to acknowledge that the whole show was in a way built on over-ambitious or over-optimistic assumptions. The first assumption was that, in a way, that if we open all our borders up, everyone will rise on aggregate, which is correct. But I think, as Carla's pointed out, there are a lot of people who didn't rise. But on aggregate, everyone did. But if you actually look at it, there's actually pockets and there's parts of major industrial economies and developed economies and elsewhere where the positive impact of a functioning multilateral trading system wasn't felt, and governments failed, in many respects businesses failed, by not continuing to mount the case and make the necessary investments to enable that to happen. But the other assumption, or the other overambitious assumption we had, was that a number of systemically important economies who were admitted into the WTO would continue to reform their own economies to ensure they were in line with the way in which the system needed to function. And I'm talking about China, Brazil, these sorts of economies. The assumption was that they would continue to reform. They would continue to reform their economies to bring themselves into line with how the WTO, the multilateral trade system, would function. The failure to do so in many respects has led us to where we are now, where the inability then for new rules, you haven't had a lot of rulemaking since the initiation of the WTO. What we also haven't had, and as a consequence of that, is the body politic making new rules. It's actually been pushed in a little way to the appellate process. And so that's one of the problems we're seeing, is because the entity itself has been unable to function as effectively as it should by people and entities not living up to their promises, then that pressure point has been taken by the appellate process. Now, I'm oversimplifying it, obviously, but I'm trying to explain, you're not going to fix this by just some sort of an agreement on a limited term for an appellate judge. We've got to actually look at this systemically. So there needs, for us, from our point of view, there needs to be a systemic review and a systemic understanding of what all needs to change, what all the parts need to change to enable a functioning WTO, not to save the future of the WTO, but to build a WTO of the future. And that's a bit that's missing at the moment. And we also need a bit of proof of life here up front. We need things like this fisheries subsidies agreement, which has been on the books for so long, to be resolved. This is proof, evidence. And I heard Ambassador Lighthizer, and I agree with him. If we can't fix these sorts of things, it'd be like if we can't get a greater adoption of the trade facilitation agreement, which in itself is a remarkable achievement to get it. But if we can't get that functioning, then what we expect of the WTO is not being lived up to now, and it could be done now without dramatic reform. So proof of life is important. The second, and I think it's, I think you pick up, that we actually do need to ensure that we bring the rule book up to date. So updating is important. We also need to look at speed. The laborious process of reaching agreement does not sit comfortably with the agile nature of a fast-moving economy that we actually live in these days, and particularly when you see a crisis. The inability of the organisation to move as quickly as it should, I think, is a real problem. So updating, speeding up the actual decision-making process, and actually ensuring that we acknowledge that we're now in a new economy where digital, which was not actually part, though, Carla, you were much more involved, I suspect, in the actual formation of the rules around the WTO. I look at it from a slightly different perspective. The WTO came into existence about a year and a half after the internet went into the public domain. So it's unsurprising that we did not fully understand, or the policymakers at the time did not understand the rules or what sort of flexibility needed to be shown to bring that digital economy into the WTO. Because even then, it was only about another year and a half or 2 years after, that payment systems digitally enabled that were actually able to function. You had the burgeoning of e-commerce. So you had all these things emerging after or in the context of the finalization of the original agreement, and it did not envisage in an effective way its capacity to deal with this. So it needs to be updated. The mere fact that last year we had to intervene on a global basis, and quite fiercely, I might say, because of the risk of the collapse of this moratorium on putting customs levies on digital downloads or cross-border digital downloads was kind of crazy. But that exists because there is no other methodology. That should be made permanent within the WTO rules. But I understand why it exists, because when we were actually setting the rules, when they were setting the rules, no one quite knew how it was going to work. So this was a workaround. So we actually kind of function the digital economy on a workaround still through the WTO. So that needs to happen. And of course, the next thing is, what's the point in having an agreement unless it can be enforced? So we need to ensure accountability. So we need to update, speed up, make relevant, and actually hold accountable. And at the same time, we need to ensure that WTO is part of a coherent whole. We do not trade without cognizance of our environment. We do not trade without cognizance of our sustainable development. We do not build businesses without cognizance or in islands. They're all part of that. So we need to ensure that the WTO, the multilateral trading system, is actually coherent, that it needs to be working on climate issues, environment issues, which frankly, the fishery subsidies agreement is the only one that it's been working on really, and nothing much is happening. So it needs to engage in that discussion, and it needs to bring in discussion on sustainable development as well. So it needs to be coherent. We're in 2020. We're not in 1990. These issues will all be incredibly important in terms of restoring the resilience of the global economy. if we don't resolve issues around these fundamental fragilities around social inequality, financial exclusion, and the safety of our planet, then there won't be a lot of stuff. There won't be a place for us to trade in, and we won't be trading in a market economy. So we need to get these things sorted, and the WTO needs to be part of joining all that as well.
Hmm. Thank you, John. You're basically saying, okay, let's, there are issues with the WTO, but let's reform the WTO, let's modernize the organization. But some are saying, well, maybe the US should just withdraw from the WTO. So what do you think, Carla? In light of the challenges, should the US just withdraw?
Absolutely not. And I think John has articulated what needs to be done, but there are answers out there. When you look at what are the reforms that the WTO needs, well, its dispute settlement has ceased to exist. And those of us who are interested in trade have looked at the Walker Principles. That's a very good start. He's got a series of issues that we should address, and which would ensure that appeals are completed in 90 days, that the appellate members don't serve more than beyond their terms, that precedents from past cases are not binding on future disputes and resolutions, that facts and municipal law are not subject to appeal, that the appellate body does not issue advisory opinions, and it does not add obligations to take away from what the members have said they will abide by. That would make a huge difference. And I think it would bring people back to the table and be able to have a functioning dispute settlement. On the negotiations, it's tough. But in my experience, when you can't get 164 people to sit down and agree, then how about to get a group of like-minded members? It worked in the past for the GATT. It worked in the past to create the WTO. And I have personal experience in this because the Uruguay round had collapsed in Europe in 1990. And we began to negotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement in 91, shook hands in 92. The president signed it, and the new president, a Democrat, got it through Congress. It took effect January 1, 1994. Within 4 months, all then 122 members of the GATT came back and picked out of the North American Free Trade Agreement rules to govern intellectual property, services, cross-border investment, and a dispute settlement. And that was called the World Trade Organization. So if 164 can't agree today, why not let a group of like-minded nations sit down and set the example on a gold standard? And I think that could happen. And the third thing that the WTO has to do is to monitor. I can't simply say that I am special and need to have special rules. Let's go to UNCTAD, and they have a criteria, data, the UN data that shows the economic achievement of all nations. It would make a difference if we had an objective standard. When you reach this standard, you're no longer able to say, I'm not going to abide by the rules, I'm too poor. And I think that that would give confidence to the organization. So no, I would not withdraw it. It's invaluable, but I would upgrade it. And I hope we can do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think you both have brought in very important detailed suggestions for how to upgrade the WTO, improve the rulemaking function, bring back the dispute settlement system. And I like very much, Carla, that you reminded us the relationship between regional agreements and the multilateral system, in particular in this concrete case of NAFTA and the WTO. We have one of our viewers is precisely asking whether bilateral and regional trade agreements actually make the WTO lose influence, or whether they can actually propel change. And I think that the example that you gave us is exactly, shows that there can be a very positive relationship between bilateral and regional agreements and the WTO.
Well, I would suggest regional and plurilateral, a group of like-minded nations that have a significant hold on the global GDP to set the example. And it could be done today. And we have been remiss in not working with our allies.
Yeah, I think that is a critical point. I want to now touch upon a subject that I think, John, you mentioned briefly, but it's very important to support participation of SMEs in international trade, which is access to timely and affordable financing. Concern has been mounted. I think you at ICC have been vocal, but likewise the IMF, the WTO, the regional banks as well, that the pandemic may be shrinking the availability of affordable and timely trade finance resources, which could in turn seriously impede the ability of trade to support the recovery. So, what can be done to close the trade finance gap, especially for developing countries, for small and medium sized enterprises? And do you think there is a role for technology in helping to digitize trade finance? Is this something that would make sense? So, John, let me please ask you for your views on these topics.
Thanks very much, Anabel. It's a really challenging issue. SMEs and micro SMEs had trouble with access to trade finance before the crisis. But golly, think about what the problem is that they're now confronting. I think it's also one of the dangers here is that as crazy as it might sound, there's a danger of anachronistic thinking here. A reason I say that is that, as I said, COVID hasn't really been with us for that long, and yet it feels like a long time. And people think they dealt with an issue at a particular point in time, and therefore it's been dealt with. But actually, when we're 6 or 7 months in, which may feel like we've been in this for eternity, when you look at it, what they did then is just not going to be enough for what actually is going on. And what I'm saying there is that early on, fair to say the policymakers at the G20 level recognized the risk from the experience, particularly with the global financial crisis, about access to trade finance. And so what they did was they made available an additional, basically encouraged an additional 50 billion, which is a large number, to actually flow in, to actually prime the pump, if I could put it that way. And people said, okay, thanks very much, and moved on. But the reality, when you look at it in context now, global trade has collapsed by about a third. To get it back, which is, and also, as you know, global trade is, an increase in global trade will be critical to an improvement in economic growth on a global basis. It accounts for a very large percentage of that. To get it back, you're going to see a need to increase global trade significantly by a third. That will require access to, on our best bet at the moment, and we'll be doing some more work on this, between $3 to $5 trillion in terms of access to liquidity for trade finance on a global basis. So one of the challenges here is that policymakers at a global level, and I fully understand there's a lot going on, you can focus on a number of things at a given time, are not focusing on issues. They think they've dealt with it. Well, what we're saying is we are identifying the contours of another crisis coming before us, which is about access to trade finance. And first of all, we see anecdotals. So the pricing we're starting to see, if you're a very large global trader, the cost for you for access to trade finance may be at 2.5 to 3%. For SMEs, it's moved to, if you can get access to it, 14 to 15%. So that becomes a tax almost on your business, which is actually going to make it impossible for you to stock the inventory, get everything that you need to go. That will be a drain on the capacity of global economy to recover. Not only devastation it will actually will actually cause within the further already challenged SME and micro SME community. So it is actually really important that we focus on this issue. You may not have noticed it, a number of the people on the call, but a number of major trading banks who are actually normally involved in trade finance are withdrawing. So we're seeing the signs, the contours of the next disaster, which is why we're acting now. And by the way, I'm very grateful, Anabel, you've agreed to participate. We've launched an action group on trade finance because we think, as I said, there's an anachronistic view here that it's been dealt with. Well, it hasn't been. And so we need to raise its visibility. We also need to then actually identify the bridge to how we get there, which is what we're working on as well. And there needs to be work in priming the pump with export insurance groups globally. Also needs to be with regional development, multilateral development banks. So we need to do all these things as well. And we actually need to sort of think about, there's actually huge impulse at the moment in just getting access to trade finance because most of it's paper-based. So this whole issue of digitization, it is beyond ridiculous that only about, I think, 19 countries have actually signed up to the UNCITRAL model laws, which enable legal recognition to be given to digitally produced trade finance documents. We need to expedite that. That's actually a pretty easy process, and we're giving a roadmap to help countries do that. And we're certainly seeking to work with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement country to actually enable them to do that as well. So these sorts of things need to be done, must be done. In fact, why it's not done is actually weird. I mean, we're involved at the moment in discussions in one major economy, I can't say where they've agreed to what we've suggested in terms of the legal recognition of an electronic bill of lading. And they've agreed to that, and the regulatory framework has been passed. But they still, at a local level, at certain banks, are insisting upon the paper version being shown. But the problem is that people can't get from A to B to show the paper document. So you would think, but sometimes people's behaviours defies the logic of their own what they themselves are required to do. So we do need to ensure greater digitization. We actually launched a digital standards initiative as well in Singapore to actually start to try and accelerate this whole process so that we can bring the legal recognition to electronic documents. And we'll have to go on in other areas to actually enable global trade in the digital world, because we won't get the activity we need in the WTO and this sort of stuff. So in a sense, the business community and organizations like the ICC, that's what we should be doing, and we are doing it.
Yeah, thank you, John. I do think it's a critical, trade finance is a critical topic when we are thinking about recovery and bringing back SMEs to import it, to export. And I think that the job that you're doing at ICC is particularly relevant in this area. And needless to say that I fully agree with this point that, it's long overdue to fully digitize the trade finance ecosystem. And hopefully the pandemic will push us in that direction as well. So we are getting closer to our end time, unfortunately, because this has been a wonderful conversation. We have some of our regulars on the questions. Vinit Sharma also talking about this issue of digitization. But before we go, let me just I'd like to give each of you the floor to make a final reflection on the role of the trading system in helping the world recover from this pandemic. John, you wanna come in?
Well, maybe I'll just, if I could, my closing comments will be a little different. We actually now have the vacancy for the Director General of the WTO. In my opening comments, I said what we actually need to have a functioning WTO is more cooperation, and we need an institution which is able to curate and actually manage that and actually enable that. We think, and in the end, the world doesn't rest on one person, but we do think the qualities of a successful candidate need to be considered. And we do think part of their qualities must be their capacity to identify how they can help achieve this level of global cooperation. What is a coherent reform package that will enable the WTO of the future? And one thing that I'm finding pleasing, I've now met with all the DGs, save for two, I'm meeting with them later this week. All of them want to work with the private sector. All of them are committed to a multilateral trading system which functions. What we need now is someone with the leadership capability to actually support that and enable that. It's not on their own, and they will have the full support of a group like the ICC, and I'm sure they will have the full support of a group like the Peterson Institute as well. But we need to be really comfortable. We need to be really comfortable that the final candidate who is selected and is endorsed ultimately by the members reflects those qualities. Otherwise, we will not have a function. It will actually not facilitate the pathway to a functioning multilateral trading system.
Very important, John. Leadership is absolutely critical at the end. At the WTO, we have the opportunity now countries have the opportunity to select someone who could work with the private sector in moving towards that recovery. So Carla, final word from you.
I would agree with John, but we must understand that the Director General of the World Trade Organization has very, very limited powers. It is nothing like the leadership that is given to the head of the IMF or the World Bank. And hence, I think the person has to be a superb negotiator and a real diplomat. And I hope that the next Director General is a good listener, understands trade issues when he or she comes in, and so he or she can explain the pros and cons of a proposal to the membership, meeting with them in small groups, trying to drag them along, and is persuasive on the merits of open trade and the value of the World Trade Organization. I think that the priorities should be for the next Director General will be to move forward in areas requiring clarification on dispute settlement, the subsidies, and state-owned enterprises. What are the rules? What are the differences between a public entity and a government? And how do we then enforce the rules and get the data? And so that's going to be extremely important, because the main functions of the WTO are to administer the agreements, but the WTO also has power to provide a forum for negotiation and handling trade disputes, monitoring the trade policies of the members, providing technical assistance, which John has mentioned, to lesser developed countries, having committees meet with them and show them how to do digital finance, and try to get them to the UN organizations that have capacity and funds to help, and cooperating, therefore, with other international organizations. But we've got to keep the WTO strong, healthy, and moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you for some good advice on governments, on what to look for in selecting the next DG, and some good advice for the next DG on what should be his or her priorities in leading the organization. So thank you very much, Ambassador Hills. Thank you very much, John Denton, ICC Secretary General. This has been a great conversation, and I am very appreciative of you taking the time to share your views with our viewers here at TradeWinds. I also would like to thank our audience for your continued participation, and of course my colleagues at the Peterson Institute who make TradeWinds happen. Please, to our audience, stay tuned for our next episode of TradeWinds on Wednesday, September 16. I would be very pleased to host Mr. Chan Chung Singh, Minister of Trade and Industry of Singapore, to discuss the role of digital trade agreements in spurring the next lap of growth. So with that, again, thank you very much, Carla. Thank you very much, John. And see you all in our next Trade Win.